Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's the time to begin the next panel. I hope everybody had a good lunch. Nice to see such good attendance for this panel. And so, given that we will be talking quite a lot about artificial intelligence today, given the theme of the panel, I just couldn't resist it. So, this morning I went to one of these AI generative platforms, and I explained, this is, the type of panel that we're going to have. This is the topic. These are the speakers. Please write an opening speech for me. And so I'm going to share with you what I wrote. So I said, please write my opening speech for the panel. It is customary to start with a joke that's related to the panel theme. Please don't let me down. So that was my prompt. And then this is what the unnamed platform said. I'm not going to say which one. I'm quoting, "Good afternoon, everyone." So far, so good. Welcome to this exciting panel on emerging technologies in international law, discussing the impact of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons. So far, so good. I'm Professor Kubo Mačák from the University of Exeter, and it's a pleasure to moderate this distinguished panel today. So I was happy with that. And then, before we dive into serious matters, let's lighten the mood with a joke. Why did the AI programmer get kicked out of school? Because he kept crashing the class. So I think AI still has a way to go when it comes to generating humor. And so I promise you that's the end of AI-generated content for today. We will instead focus on the legal implications of emerging technologies, and especially artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons. We will have one presentation that will focus on a peacetime scenario, and that's especially the use of artificial intelligence tools for penetration testing. And then 3 presentations that focus on various questions of artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, in situations of armed conflict. So taking the perspective of international humanitarian law, or IHL. Now, in discussions with our wonderful panelists, we agreed to use a classic, a traditional format. So we will have 4 presentations of up to 15 minutes each, so that they get a chance to present their papers that they have prepared, 3 of which are published in the conference proceedings, and their legal analysis during their presentations. And then we will have a joint Q&A session at the end. So, you're welcome to start thinking about the questions you might ask to our panelists afterwards. I'm going to introduce our speakers now, and then we will proceed with each of the presentations one after the other. And so they are also seated in the order in which they will speak. So first we have Wei-Che Wang, who goes also by Wayne. And Wayne is a researcher at the National Institute of Cybersecurity, which is a leading cybersecurity think tank in Taiwan. Wayne has a multidisciplinary background in information engineering and also in law from the National University of Taiwan. And currently his research focus is on cybersecurity issues that are related to emerging technology and to international policy and legislation. So that's Wayne. Then we have Taylor Woodcock. So Taylor is a PhD researcher in public international law at the University of Amsterdam and at T.M.C. Institute. And Taylor's research examines the implications of the development and use of military applications of artificial intelligence for international law, with a particular focus on IHL, on international humanitarian law. And Taylor's current research project that she will speak in part about is funded by the Dutch Research Council program on responsible innovation. After Taylor, we will have Scott Sullivan. And so Scott is a professor at the US Military Academy at West Point, and specifically he's assigned to the Army Cyber Institute and the Department of Law. Scott's work has received funding from the European Commission and the United States National Security Agency, and his current research focuses on the intersection of emerging technologies and cybersecurity with international and also US national security law. So that's Scott. And then last but not least, we will have Jonathan Kwik. And so Jonathan is a researcher in international law at T.M.C. Institute. And his specialization is in artificial intelligence and law governing the conduct of hostilities, a distinct part of IHL, international humanitarian law. And Jonathan is also the author of the book Lawfully Using Autonomous Weapon Technologies, which will be published with Springer in September this year. Congratulations, Jonathan, on the book. We look forward to seeing it. And with that, all of our 4 panelists have been introduced. I'm really excited about this panel, what they have to share with us. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Wayne, who's going to give us a presentation that's entitled Using AI for Security, Taking Taiwan as an Example. Over to you, Wayne.
Thank you, Kubo, and thank you having me here. Today I'm going to share my research with everyone here, and I'm trying to illustrate a picture about when AI tools becomes very capable, and they can do very much about doing cybersecurity and what would happen next by discussing two extra issues. So I think we all agree that the development of AI technology and its application in cybersecurity offense and defense evolves very quickly, and it have very many to discuss. So here I would like to take penetration testing as an example for that. Penetration testing is a very highly technique in cybersecurity, and it's more complex and difficult task in traditional for cybersecurity assessments. So if there's an AI tool which can achieve the penetration testing work by itself or by human order, that would be arise some issues to be discussed. Like the first one would be related legal compliance issues while using these AI tools. And the second one would be there may be some liability issues when this AI cause some damages. So I would start from trying to figure out the fundamental of the penetration testing. By the definition from NIST, we know that penetration testing can be divided into 4 main stages. The first one, planning, and followed by discovery, and followed by attack, and finally to produce a report. So we know that typically this PT is conducted by experienced cybersecurity experts using the same techniques or tools as the hackers or attackers to test the system security. And here what I would like to express is there may be the possibility to have AI tools achieving the main goal of each stage, and thus the tool can use to perform the PT. So like the first planning is this main goal would be confirm the execution, the authorization and documentation. For the discovery, that would be data collection to scan and to analyze the vulnerabilities. So, sounds like that. And so for each stage, there will be a corresponding AI tool to achieve the goal. And once they're combined together, this PT thing, we can assume that it's possible to do by AI tools. So once we have the AI tools with this capability to perform PT, here comes the first issue. If I were a public servant in a government, and I have the ability to access this kind of tool, what would I take these tools to do? And so I would like to introduce that in Taiwan we have a special law named Cybersecurity Management Act, which regulates the cybersecurity requirements of mostly public sectors and some of important private sectors like CI providers in Taiwan. And the CMA requires the agencies or organizations with a cybersecurity responsibility level, which level this level ranges from A to E, depends on the importance of the agency or the IT system they have, and the law requires they regularly conduct PT once a year or even twice a year on their core IT systems. However, we all know that agencies have limited resources. The PT may cause financial burden. So if I have used these tools I mentioned to conduct PT, would it be legal compliance? So to figure it out, we have to think about what kind of PT complies with the law. It's that whether the effect of the execution meet the need of the agency's cybersecurity defense, rather than merely determine whether tools were used for execution. So, the real important thing would be, what do we want to learn from this PT, from this report? So the submit test report must be comprehensive. Like, the report must with details from the method used to discover vulnerabilities, the attack techniques employed, and you have to assess the risk level of the vulnerabilities. This is all about for the agencies to provide the next actionable improvement recommendations so that the agency can follow these improvement recommendations to strengthen their cybersecurity protection after they've done the PT. So my thought is, right now the regulation doesn't prohibit the way using what technique to perform a PT. The more important thing is whether the tasks are complete by to the reports and the results, whether they can help the agency to improve their cybersecurity or not. And this follows the next question. Like, once an agency, there's an agency who use the AI tool to do the PT thing, they might be causing damages. When using AI tools to PT, that unfortunately that results in some damages, we have to discuss who to bear the liability. And so far we know that AI cannot act as a subject of liability. So there are two types of roles that I may need to discuss. The first one would be like the providers or developers or suppliers of the AI tool. The second one would be like the user who use these controls these AI tools, right? In like internal operators within the agency or the organization, or you are outsourcing personnel from outsourced service providers. So potential damage during PT execution may be data leaking, system corrupting, or even worse, some hacker to invasion while the PT tool is running. So the question would be, can the victim seek compensation as regular civil case? And this goes to the characteristics of AI, which we call usually call black box. And the black box would make it difficult for the injured party, the victims, hard to present evidence in litigation. So right now we see EU's besides the AI Act, EU has proposed amendments to Product Liability Directive and the AI Liability Directive, both implying that it's important to deal with the burden of proof. So both of the Liability Directive establish specific mechanisms for the determination of causation to balance technological development and user protection. Other possible approach besides the EU structure is, for example, we may not be making new laws trying to regulate AI, but we can adjust some existing law like consumer protection regulations, make the existing law be able to handle the new AI cases. Either way, the methods or frameworks for AI legislation, I think it will be okay, but it must be thoroughly considered. So my conclusion would bring out in 2 points. The first one is, as I mentioned, AI-related legislation needs thorough consideration. So besides managing the whole AI life cycle, we may consider about how to manage the AI and how to regulate them. We have to consider it the potential litigation or disputes arising from its use as well. And the other side, enhancing the security of AI will improve AI for security. So here's 2 things we can do now. The first one is develop methods to evaluate the security of AI tools. And once we can tell which AI tool is low risk enough, we can do the next thing like provide a list of validated low risk AI tools for government agencies or organizations to utilize in their daily work. And that's what Taiwan's government trying to do right now. For example, Taiwan is establishing our own large language model, and it's for the public sector, for the agencies to do the daily work. And also, we are trying to develop, to find a way to evaluate the security of AI tools. And so that's my sharing today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you very much for sharing your reflections on this topic, both about the general framework and also the specific Taiwanese perspective. So I would just encourage everyone who has specific questions for Wayne, you can already note them down and there will be a chance to ask during the shared Q&A. And so we move on to Taylor Woodcock, who's going to present a paper on human-machine learning interactions, human agency, and international humanitarian law. Over to you, Taylor.
Thank you. Human-machine learning interactions, human agency, and international humanitarian law. It's wordy. You have to forgive the lawyer. But on a more serious note, recent reporting on events in ongoing conflicts demonstrates that the use of AI in the military domain is not somewhere over the horizon, but that we do seem to be increasingly accelerating towards it. So in light of this, today I'm going to talk to you about the use of data-driven AI, such as machine learning, for offensive military applications as well as intelligence analysis. Now, whilst we'll be discussing the concept of human agency, it's really not a question of what is better, the human or the machine, but rather what happens when these two interact and the legal dimension that results from this. So you may wonder the relevance of this for cyber defense and security, which is a fair question. As the reach of cyber grows and the scope of the cyber domain interacts with other military domains, it's crucial to think holistically about issues surrounding emerging technologies as cyber and kinetic capabilities merge in our increasingly digital battle space, and we really need to understand what the technology does to consider this. So I invite you to think along with me today about the potential crossovers regarding the use of data-driven AI across domains, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this in the discussion also. So today I'm going to be talking to you first about applications of data-driven AI to support decision-making in the military domain. Second, practices of legal reasoning with international humanitarian law. Third, how we can situate human agency within these practices. And fourth and finally, the impact of data-driven AI on practices of legal reasoning with IHL. So, beginning first with data-driven AI in military targeting operations. Now, debates on military AI typically tend to revolve around autonomous weapon systems, AWS. And these are often defined as systems that identify, select, and engage targets without human intervention. However, in addition to this, there's also broad scope for the integration of software-based AI applications into military targeting processes. And these sort of systems are in contrast to AWS because they don't necessarily have this kind of hardware, physical platform. Now, when we talk about data-driven AI, we're talking particularly about techniques such as machine learning. And whilst this also has relevance for autonomous weapons, it's important to note that not all autonomous weapons will have data-driven algorithms, and not all data-driven AI will be used for autonomous weapons systems. And in fact, there is broad scope for a range of applications of data-driven AI in the military domain. And to kind of illustrate this, you'll see on the screen some examples of current systems that integrate these sorts of software. So this includes Palantir's Gotham system, the US Sentinel system, Chinese Stasi real-time combat intelligence guidance system. There's also been experimentation by the US Department of Defense with Project Lima into generative AI, large language models, as well as the reported use of algorithmic systems such as the Lavender and Gospel system by the Israeli Defense Force recently in Gaza. So these applications raise questions about the impact of on military decision-making and operations when humans interact with these systems and the legal dimensions of this, and really just to shows how close we are getting to that horizon after all. So this leads us to the question, okay, international law. Now I'm going to start with what I'm not going to talk about, and that's by answering the question, is the use of these systems lawful or not? Now you might just think this an odd approach from a legal perspective. However, the law is not simply a checklist, and unfortunately, especially in debates on autonomous weapons, it has been treated like this. And it's very difficult to say in abstract terms whether or not the use of these systems can enable compliance with international humanitarian law. So, in the last 10 years, over a decade of debates on autonomous weapons, there's still not clarity on this question of whether the use of the systems are lawful. So in order to deal with some of these challenges, I propose that we reframe the question a little bit by looking at not only what the law says, but what we do with the law in practice. And this leads me to practices of legal reasoning. Now, law is made up of very many practices, and this includes practices of legal reasoning in military operations, for instance, by commanders and supported by military legal advisors. Legal reasoning can be understood as a practice where there is interpretation of legal norms and the application of these to factual scenarios in order to make legal claims. Now, typically we think about legal reasoning as it occurs in a courtroom after conduct has already occurred, but equally it also occurs in advance of conduct, when practitioners are deciding what course of action to take. Of course, there are many different factors that guide conduct in military operations, but law is one that we need to consider. So what then is the relevance of human agency to all of this? So we heard in our opening panel this morning comments both about the individual being at the heart of cybersecurity, as well as the idea that for offensive capabilities, a human should remain in the loop when AI systems are used. The relevance of human agency really comes to the forefront when we look through the lens of practices, as practices are constituted through the actions of persons, of practitioners. And these practices really assume the existence of human actors. And of course, when we're talking about legal reasoning, there are also human actors who engage in these practices of legal reasoning. And this raises the question about when AI is used to support decision-making, how does this impact the ability of the human in the loop to exercise their agency? Do these technologies mediate and shape human practices, including practices of legal reasoning? And this is the question we will dive into a little more deeply for our remaining time together. So when considering the impact of data-driven AI on practices of legal reasoning with international humanitarian law, IHL in particular, there are 3 dimensions I would like to talk to you about today, and they are contextualization, background knowledge, and substantiation. So turning first to contextualization, this is the idea that when the law is interpreted, this is not done in the abstract, but always with regard to a specific factual scenario. In this sense, reliance on AI may impact the case-by-case nature of legal assessments in accordance with IHL. Now, under IHL, there are certain standards that require a high degree of contextualization, and we can think in particular about the principles of proportionality and precautions here. These assessments cannot be determined in the abstract, but must be based on the prevailing circumstances. So the question that is pertinent here is what happens when AI shapes how the battle space and the prevailing circumstances are perceived by military practitioners. AI systems, in particular using machine learning, produce information about the battle space on the basis of past statistical patterns. Now this is important because they do so rather than judging the situation and analysing it on its own terms, including all of the nuance and novelty that may be produced in a dynamic military environment. So, using AI without the prudent exercise of human agency is like trying to drive a car forward by only using the rear vision mirror, privileging past patterns reflected in training datasets in order to predict the future. Now, in society, we do use statistics to predict the future, but this is at a macro level, and military targeting is not macro. It's micro and individualized, and the legal assessments of this conduct likewise need to be individualized and contextualized. Factors that were statistically relevant from the training dataset may not be legally relevant when analyzing a complex and dynamic battle space. Turning now to the second point on background knowledge. Now, this is a vague concept, but it basically captures the idea that the content of the law doesn't list all of the relevant variables and factors that need to be accounted for in a legal assessment, but there is some background knowledge that practitioners are expected to bring with them. And there are two particular dimensions of background knowledge that kind of characterize legal assessments under IHL that I'd like to mention. The first is the qualitative nature of some IHL assessments, and also the value-laden quality of these assessments. So when considering the qualitative nature of some of the assessments, we really need to consider that AI can shape the conditions in which legal and other decisions are made, increasing the speed, scale, and complexity in military operations. Now, of course, there may be benefits to this, but there are also risks that it closes space for meaningful engagement with the law and the exercise of human agency. Now, of course, you may consider, well, this already happens to some degree if we consider, for instance, dynamic targeting in comparison to deliberate targeting. But the impact that AI has on choice architectures by creating this perception of urgency, increasing speed of operations, means that it's shifting all targeting towards a more dynamic engagement, potentially with a lower threshold for when it comes to considering legal assessments under IHL, and this is something we need to consider. AI can also have a normalizing effect on qualitative assessments. So I would like you to consider this example of Spotify, the music playing platform that now has a new function to generate AI-based playlists. Now, at first, these playlists are based on your own individual listening habits. However, over time, with habitual use, at what point do your habits become shaped by the AI recommendations? Now, AI has a normalizing effect using statistical averages to identify patterns and apply these to new data. The normalizing effect of AI, when habitually used over time, can be similar to these Spotify playlists, reshaping our notions and legal categories according to an algorithmic logic. And this has the potential to reframe what we view as targets, what we view as reasonable conduct, or feasible precautions. Legal assessments may not hinge on a statistical norm, but on nuance and novelty. AI, however, tends to fix one particular interpretation of a situation, when really we need to be able to stay agile and adaptive to a dynamic battle space. And this is particularly relevant given the proclivity of AI systems to compound human cognitive biases, such as automation bias, where humans tend to overtrust the system. Now, the second dimension under background knowledge is value-laden. And this is the idea that these legal assessments also need to be able to account for values, whether this is the value of human life, the balancing of military necessity and humanitarian considerations, or other cultural military values such as own force protection. Ensuring that the battle space is not just seen in terms of statistical data points, but that these values can be accounted for is crucial when it comes to the use of AI. So the third and final dimension of legal reasoning I'll touch on very briefly is the substantiation of legal claims. Now, something discussed about AI often is its lack of transparency or explainability. This can present challenges and obstacles when military practitioners rely on these algorithmic systems and yet are not able to understand the reasoning behind why certain output was generated. So if an algorithm suggests a certain target, it's not clear exactly what variables and patterns were the basis for this recommendation. And this can also present challenges for then military practitioners substantiating their own legal claims and a further need to seek further verification. So, two conclusions that we can draw from this. The first is that AI does something substantively different than what humans do when engaging in legal assessments. The second is that AI can frame and condition the way that these legal assessments are conducted and thus impact how human agency is exercised in military operations. So these tensions that I've identified along the lines of contextuality, background knowledge, and substantiation are things that we have to recognize when thinking about the way that AI can impact military operations and how military practitioners can conduct prudent legal assessments. Now, none of this is to say that these problems are insurmountable, but they certainly need to be considered. You might ask, well, there's a human in the loop still, so what's the problem? But there needs to be adequate scope for verification of AI output and prudent legal assessments that are contextual, qualitative, and value-laden. Keeping in mind the tendency of data-driven AI to increase speed, scale, and complexity, those conducting legal assessments need to be able to slow things down, avoid treating the law like a checklist, recognize the ways in which AI can shape choice architectures and prompt human biases, and understand how we can preserve human agency when these systems are integrated into military operations. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Taylor. I really loved your Spotify effect mention. You know, I have this same experience. I started using Spotify to calm my dog when I leave home. So I put like this calming music for my dog. And now I have been subjected to the same bias. Spotify is now recommending the same music just for me all the time. But I thank you also for, on a more serious note, for making the very important distinction between data-driven AI in military application and autonomous weapon systems, which is often forgotten, and I think it will animate some of our discussion later on, and also for your challenge to us to think about the law differently and to think, if I may say so, also about human agency in slightly different terms. So thank you, very thought-provoking. With that, we move on to Scott, who has a paper on targeting in the black box. Scott, over to you.
Thank you. So first, I want to start off with a thank you to Kubo and Davide on relationship to this panel. I think it's really exciting. I need to thank my co-author, who's Dr. Eben Ricketts, who's also my wife. As I told one of my co-panelists, it's like I have a technological genius captive in my own home, and that can be very useful for this type of work. And I think Taylor's presentation is a great bridge because the third point that she touched on briefly is something I'm going to be focused on. But let me start by noting that I'm going to be speaking in my personal capacity. The ideas are my own, and they don't necessarily reflect that of the United States, the US Military Academy, the Army Cyber Institute, the DoD, or any of its constituent parts, in case you were wondering. Right? Taylor mentioned this, and I think it is worth reiterating. The panel that we're on is about the impact of AI in autonomous weapon systems. And I think we often think of that in relationship to each other, right? The idea of AI and autonomous weapon systems being inextricable. I'm going to be focusing on AI targeting platforms, which obviously are part of the autonomous weapons system, but also deserve some individualized attention. And specifically, the problem of explainability, the black box problem. So thus the title of the paper, Targeting the Black Box. As Taylor also mentioned, we're seeing the deployment of AI targeting platforms already. The Israeli-Hamas conflict has demonstrated a couple of them, Hobsbawm and Lavender. Details on the systems are sparse, but the IDF has recognized that Hobsbawm in particular has been an AI tool that has increased exponentially the amount of targets available for striking. And if the public reporting is true, and I think that there's reason to believe that something approaching it is true, is that commanders are given targets that are associated with a yellow or a red or a green light. And essentially green means that it is targetable, red means that it's not, and yellow obviously is somewhere in between. This is not a lot of information, and I think it goes to this fundamental question that we don't have our arms around just yet, which is, to what extent are these AI targeting systems understandable to the users and to their designers? This is like I said, the black box problem. And I think there's 3 ways of thinking about the explainability problem in AI platforms. One of which is the idea of opacity as a product of law or policy. So in this context, we don't know how these AI targeting platforms work, in part because there are legal protections that keep these things opaque to us, right? So they're often classified, and so you're unable to know how the system works. Even if it's perfectly explainable, there are legal protections that preclude that. The second is opacity as a product of technological illiteracy. I don't know how my phone's touchscreen works because I don't understand the technology. I couldn't explain to you how it works because I'm illiterate in that sense. So to the extent that you don't have the knowledge of how systems work like that, it's difficult to explain them. The most pernicious or the most dangerous, I think, type of explainability problem, though, is something that we might think of as opacity as cognitive mismatch. Here, the problem is that the technology is difficult to understand because the very means by which the AI system works is a poor fit for the reasoning and mental processing possessed by the human brain. And our piece focuses on deep neural networks as the type of black box problem that is likely to fuel autonomous weapons systems in the future. Now, deep neural networks, if you're unfamiliar, start with an input layer. They have 1 or more hidden layers and an output layer. Now, each layer includes individual nodes and layers. These are essentially mini algorithmic tools with their own sets of input data, weights, thresholds, and an output. Those layers interact with each other, and they're multiplied by their respective weights, summed and passed through an activation function. And if the final output exceeds a specific threshold, the neuron is activated and passed through to the next network layer. The data is passed from one to the other until you ultimately have an output. Now, that output, I think, within the context of what we've seen in these AI targeting platforms, is something akin to often that idea of the red, green, or yellow light. Now, these neural networks have become increasingly complex. They include hundreds or thousands of layers with millions and sometimes billions of parameters. So the model ultimately creates a conclusion, but often with these systems, the mismatch between the way the models are working and the knowledge that we possess means that no matter, in the words of one commentator, no matter how much knowledge we possess on mathematics, computation, or any other related science, the systems are unintelligible. Now, this variation in explainability challenges matter. The first 2, the legal opacity, right, and the idea of technological illiteracy, are easier to resolve, obviously, than the cognitive mismatch problem. You can use things like SHAP values, which essentially tell you something about how the system is, what it's relying upon in coming to its conclusion in the first 2 types of problems. But you can't use it very well with the cognitive mismatch issue. So what is the problem with this as it relates to law and international humanitarian law in particular? Well, first, generally, I think we're all pretty familiar with the idea that explanations matter a lot in law. So this is especially true in circumstances where we think that the consequences of an act are severe. So we could say, officer, why did you search that individual for drugs? And we expect that officer to have an explanation why they did it, an explanation they can articulate. When we have a commander that has targeted an area, we say, why did you target that area? And we expect the commander to have an explanation as to why they did it. Now, in part, we have that requirement for an explanation because we have legal standards that demand those types of explanations. And within the context of international humanitarian law, we see within basic principles of IHL, explanations are often very important, and often it's going to be required, we would think, for legal compliance. So the principle of distinction is perhaps the easiest one in which we might imagine AI targeting platforms being of value. And obviously, distinction requires a state to distinguish between combatants and civilians. And sometimes this can be simple, where you have the naval battleship out at sea and a heat signature of a missile is coming, there's not much concern about identifying that as something that is targetable. But often it's quite difficult, and I think in particular in relationship to the direct participation in hostilities. For that type of issue of direct participation, you have the variance in relationship to what constitutes direct participation. We have temporal questions as to when that direct participation begins and when it ends. These things are difficult, if not impossible, for AI systems, often focused on the past, right, to identify these sorts of questions with the type of precision that we would require. Now, absent an understanding of why the system identifies a target as directly participating or not, it's difficult to understand how that universe might change in a world in which the circumstances change. So the dynamism of the circumstance itself creates a problem. In relationship to the principle of proportionality, we have this requirement to ensure that the damage to civilian persons and objects is not disproportionate to the concrete military advantage achieved. Now, assessing civilian damage is perhaps one of the areas where we would expect AI targeting systems to excel, but there's another part of that balance which is just as important, which is identifying the concrete military advantage perceived. So here there's a quantitative and a qualitative element. And according to state views, assessing military advantage is highly subjective. For example, Germany has said that such an assessment is on a case-by-case basis and that no abstract calculations are possible. Taking that seriously, it's difficult to imagine an AI targeting platform being able to identify when the military concrete advantage would be achieved. It's also a circumstance where we have a holistic assessment rather than just an atomistic. So Canada, for example, requires an honest and reasonable expectation that the attack will make a relevant contribution to the success of the overall operation, which suggests an understanding of the overall operation in order to make that assessment. And it is a very dynamic circumstance as well. Military advantage often fluctuates dependent upon things going on elsewhere in the conflict. If you don't know how an AI platform crafts its assessment of concrete military advantage, how will you know whether it's properly weighted? Finally, the principle of precaution and constant care. This is an area where there is perhaps the most direct challenge to black box AI targeting platforms. Customary law in Article 57 of Additional Protocol 1 require commanders to engage in certain precautions to protect civilians and civilian objects. Article 57.1 sets out the broader requirement that states take constant care in the conduct of their military operations to spare civilians and civilian objects. This is not just limited to attacks. So the scope of constant care is something that is, frankly, constantly debated. But many recognize that the breadth of military operations is one that reaches into planning stages, planning orientation. And if that's the case, then there exists already a requirement embedded within the design of an AI system to create explainability itself, such that you're able to constantly assess whether or not civilian objects are being properly protected. The precautionary obligations in 57.2, which relates to precautions associated with attack, depend on a commander's understanding of the basis of a targeting recommendation. Specifically, when feasible, the commander has to engage in verification. So commanders must do everything feasible to engage in the verification of the validity of the targeting attack. And it's difficult to imagine how one engages in verification if you don't know the basis for the targeting itself. If you don't know why the conclusion was reached, how are you expected to verify that? Now, the scope of the requirement in relationship to feasibility is one that in the past has sort of been understood and is appropriately understood to be limited to the information available to the commander and that which is viable to do in relationship to verification. And at some level, one might argue that the use of an AI system's green or red light system is one that is almost automatically fulfilled given the paucity of the information. And I don't think that that's ultimately appropriate. It maybe perhaps proves too much. So, in conclusion, my point is I want to identify two major themes, right? One of which is to recognize that we have difficulties in relationship to understanding how AI systems come to their conclusions, what they're weighing, how they assess circumstances and come to their conclusions in a manner that precludes commanders from fulfilling their legal obligations, which is based on an IHL system that demands an understanding of the particular components that lead to that targeting decision. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you, Scott. That was brilliant, and really, the way that you highlight these epistemic barriers for our understanding, that explainability really requires what Taylor has called this intersubjective dimension of human agency. It's something that happens between humans as they need to explain the way these systems work. And if we don't if we don't have them as explainable in this sense, it poses problems for the application of the law. So thank you very much for that compelling presentation. And with that, we move on to Jonathan, who will deliver the fourth presentation of today. And so Jonathan is going to speak about the scope of an autonomous attack. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Kubo. Thank you, Davide, for organizing this fantastic panel. I think most of our topics complement each other very well. My final brief for this day is titled The Scope of an Autonomous Attack. The title is brief, but the ramifications are not. To start my presentation, I would probably like to depart from an observation. And it's on the distinction of how this one word, actually, this one term in IHL attack has been grappled with in cyber versus in the discussion concerning autonomous weapon systems. Now, most lawyers, even most people somewhere aware of cyber, probably know that in the realm of cyber, the term of attack has been subject to quite a lot of discussion. It has actually challenged a few norms or a few conceptions of what it means, what an attack means in IHL. A good example is, for example, that an attack has to cause violence, according to IHL, but this was not as clear in the beginning. For example, when a cyber attack just destroys data, is this violence or not, question mark. So the term has been subject to a lot of debate. Whilst, in contrast, when we're talking about the debate on autonomous weapon systems, most of the attention has been based on a further step. Usually the question is about can they properly implement precautions? Can they make proportionality calculations, for example? But one of my theses of today is that the attack question itself is actually an issue worth discussing. Now, at one side, I understand why there's not been as much attention on the word of attack, because in comparison to cyber, it seems much more clear. Obviously, an autonomous weapon system, as it's usually conceived, it's a physical system with AI inside that is being used to aid in its functionality, intended to inflict harm to an opponent. You can think of a drone, for example, sent across the horizon to attack a target or targets in a specific area with a missile. Now, obviously, this is physical violence intended to inflict harm to the opponent. So, evidently, launching an autonomous weapon is an attack. Also, I'd like to start with a few points of convergence that in the international debate, there is broad agreement that IHL applies to autonomous weapons, and when launching autonomous attacks, commanders which wield these weapons must uphold targeting rules, distinction, precautions, proportionality. One thing that I would add is also agreeing with my co-panelists is that the commander is obliged to know enough about this system to be able to make these distinctions and to make these legal decisions. So in my presentation, I will not be discussing the question if the system itself can make these legal can make these legal decisions, for example, concerning proportionality or precautions, I'll be assuming that it is the commander who is making these decisions at the moment the commander is launching an attack. So up till this point, it might seem that this is a relatively resolved matter, but is it really? In my paper, I am challenging the reader with this toy scenario, and it basically concerns a commander, let's call him Mr. A, who has an autonomous system, who is going to launch it to attack a tank platoon inside of a city. There are 4 tanks, the system is sent, and during the scuffle there, because it's an aerial system, it launches 7 missiles against these tanks. It then returns. 3 hours later, there are 4 more tanks that were identified by this commander. The same system is sent to attack 4 arteries where these 4 tanks were positioned. The question is, how many attacks has this commander launched today? Now, it's very possible that your intuition concerning this question might differ from your neighbors, because there's many units of measurement we can use to answer this question. We can, for example, say, okay, for each activation, this is a separate attack, in which case the commander launched 2 attacks today. You can also say, okay, we should count it per tank. Because there were 7 tanks in this scenario, the person launched 7 attacks. Or you can even say, okay, each shot is a separate attack. Now, perhaps at this point, you might be saying, okay, sure, this is interesting, but perhaps is it not just academic nitpicking? Is this truly relevant? Well, it is, because attack is a very important legal unit of measurement in IHL, and it affects the stringency of targeting obligations. Just to give an example, there is a very significant difference between if we analyze the scenario by taking the position that each activation is an attack versus each shot being an attack. Because obligations such as the obligation to verify, the obligation to determine if an attack was proportional or not, up to which point an attack should be cancelled, depends very much on how broadly or how narrowly we define an attack. For example, if we define this per shot, then this, in fact, precludes the use of autonomous systems altogether. Because you can imagine that even in the first case of 12 hours, where the autonomous system was sent to attack 4 tanks, during which it released 7 shots, this means if each shot is an attack, the commander has to be right on top of it. Each time the first tank dodges, for example, and the system wants to relaunch a missile, the commander has to make another legal determination. If this is a valid target, if there is a proportionality question, etc. Versus an activation perspective, where this test only needs to be done once, at 12 o'clock and at 15 o'clock. So the problematization that I wish to emphasize in this paper is there's actually a lack of consistent methodology to determine when an autonomous attack legally starts and ends. And I see that a very significant issue in the overall debate concerning what level autonomy is lawful is actually a symptom of this larger legal ambiguity. Because there are people who say that, okay, autonomy is not allowed, and that would be correct if you adopt the shot interpretation. While there are also positions which say that, okay, autonomy is allowed in many situations, which is also reasonable if you adopt the activation perspective. Also, this is an undesirable situation, in my opinion, because it also provides no transparency for commanders as to whether they've correctly discharged their legal obligations. As I've mentioned previously, an attack is the legal unit of measurement for which legal obligations must be discharged. So imagine that a commander launches an attack and something goes wrong. This is bad for both bad faith and good faith commanders. For bad faith commanders, afterwards, when they're asked to explain their decision and why this occurred, it provides a level of deniability because there's been no agreement on what the appropriate scope of an attack is. They can always broaden or narrow the attack to prevent accountability for themselves by saying, okay, I've discharged it at 12 hours. What is the problem? But for good faith commanders, it's also undesirable because this might provide some ex post arbitrariness, where something went wrong, and then, for example, the tribunal says, well, no, sir or ma'am, you should have conducted a legal examination prior to each shot of your system, while they have not done this, for example. So to aid with this issue, I have theorized on a methodology to define possible attack scopes, and there are a few. First is shot, where each shot is considered a separate attack. So this is the example I provided previously. There's also a different way of viewing this, is that it's single. So all shots, so all missiles fired at one particular entity, so for example one tank, classifies as only one attack. So this means that a commander has to discharge their legal targeting obligations with respect to each target, but not specifically for each attack, for each shot. Another possibility is group. So for example, in the 1200 hours sortie, there was a group of tanks that was co-located. Well, you can say that all of the shots released against this group of tanks qualifies as one attack. And this is not strange, because you can think, for example, of an artillery volley. Well, commanders don't make legal determinations based on each individual rocket or each individual tank that they find in a certain area. No, they do the legal analysis beforehand, order the volley, and this is considered the attack for which the legal analysis was performed. Finally, you can do a signature analysis, of course. You can think of an anti-system, of an anti-missile system, which bases its targeting on a signature. And this was previously mentioned, for example, a certain heat signature. And all of the shots released against this particular signature qualifies as an attack. Now, I argue that the question first is, can you adopt a global position? That, okay, for any autonomous attack, this is the correct interpretation. My argument is no, because if you go too far to the left, this is legally inconsistent. First, the law talks about acts of violence, referring to the fact that many shots or many instances of violence can be combined into one attack. A legal test is not always per shot, as I've just given an example of the artillery volley, for example. And proportionality allows joining multiple strikes, multiple related attacks into one legal analysis. So, for example, always interpreting a shot as an attack is not the correct interpretation. On the other hand, if we also go too far to the right, this is also a problem. So, for example, if you just say that each activation is an attack, imagine if the drone then flies around for 6 hours, releases hundreds of shots at many different targets. Now, obviously, this is not what IHL desires, because it desires some legal protection in the form of verification. Is this truly a legitimate target? Is the collateral damage not excessive vis-à-vis the military advantage gained, etc.? So a global position is not tenable. For that reason, I've tried to strike a balance between military efficiency and protection on both sides. And as you can see, the more you go to the left, protection increases, but military efficiency decreases. Obviously, if each shot has to be monitored by a commander, this offers the best possible protection for civilians, because each possible shot will be checked, okay, did something change or not? But this is extremely military inefficient. You can imagine an Iron Dome, where each time a missile will be shot to intercept another missile, a commander has to check and approve it. Obviously, for many situations, this is impossible. On the other hand, like I said, if you go too much to the right, this drastically compromises the legal protections offered by IHL. So the solution I offer in my paper is actually based on, both based on law and based on an intuition that has been reflected in much of the discussion on IHL. And it can be summarized by this one line. An attack is one specific military operation limited in space and time. And I propose that this proximity in time and space, in time and space, should be decisive. And going back to the discussion, especially Scott's point about the importance of epistemic certainty, there should be sufficient epistemic certainty of the commander to make informed legal decisions and implement precautions. And this influences how broadly the proximity in time and space can be allowed. So, for example, you can think of an underwater environment where it is relatively static. Well, in this case, you can, for example, launch a signature attack, where all particular military signatures can be targeted by a particular system for a lengthy amount of time. This is fine, because the epistemic certainty is still there. Not much is changing. The dynamicity of the environment is not particularly high. There are not a lot of civilians. There's not a lot of collateral concerns, etc. Compared to, for example, if you launch an attack in an urban environment, well, here, there is a very high probability that the legally relevant presumptions do not hold throughout the attack's duration. So from the moment that you launch the attack, there's a very significant probability that things might change. So here, the allotted proximity and time and space would decrease substantially, to the point where it is much more reasonable to go much more to the left, arguing that, okay, you should make legal distinctions on a group level, or on a target level, or even on a shot level. So to go back to my previous example, this is how this scenario would be solved according to this methodology. The 12 hours sortie would be classified as one group attack, because this is one group limited in space, and it is quite possible that all of these 7 shots will be launched on rapid succession. So this would fulfill the proximity in time and space criterion. Compared to the 15-hour sortie, where clearly these tanks are separate in space, and there is travel time between attacks on each tank. So here, according to this methodology, this would rather qualify as 4 single attacks. Each tank is a separate attack, even though it's effectuated using the same system. Also be careful, what this means is that for each of these arrows that you see here, a legal analysis must be performed. So this is a good balance between not being overly unreasonable in terms of operational realism on the battlefield, and also the protection of civilians. I'm also giving a different example of how this methodology would apply to proportionality and cancelling, which
Jonathan,
I offer.
to interrupt. I would just ask you to start drawing to a close.
Yes, which I offer in the paper, which I encourage you to read. And we can continue this in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And indeed, I encourage everyone to read all of the papers that were presented. So for the 3 of our panelists, for Wayne, Scott, and Jonathan, you will find them in the conference proceedings. And Taylor's presentation was also based in part on her paper in the journal Global Society. And I'm sure Taylor will be happy to then share the reference with those interested in finding out more. So I would encourage everyone who wants to learn more about their arguments to read the papers in full. With that, we have about 20 minutes for the discussion. So let's see if we already have some questions in the audience. And you have to raise your hand high up because the lights are really strong. No, not at the moment. So I start seeing some hands. So let's go directly to the audience. We will start with the lady in the front and then go just there on the right, on my right. And I would ask you to wait for the microphone to reach you, and if you could introduce yourselves before you pose your question. So let's take this round of 2 questions and then give an opportunity to the panelists to respond. Please.
Hi, hello. My name is Cornelia Ebbers. I'm with Microsoft Government Affairs in Europe. My question is on the regulation bit. So as we see in all your talks, there are many open questions regarding explainability, how we counterattack, many open questions. So my question would be on a global level, when we talk about establishing rules on this, internationally, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons has been unsuccessful as a kind of forum to establish international norms. What are your ideas or thoughts on this? Where do you see this going? Or do you see maybe even national militaries or even organizations like NATO having a leading role in starting to answer some of these questions and have an international codification process so that militaries interacting with each other agree on the norms coming out of this?
Thank you. And we had another question just on my right, so on your left. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Captain Commander Marie van Hofstad. I'm legal advisor to the Belgian cyber commander, but in my previous life, I was a military legal advisor in conventional operations. Thank you very much to all four speakers. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed the panel. I'm looking forward to reading all of your papers. I have two questions, one for Taylor, one for Jonathan. To Taylor, you once mentioned that the use of AI systems could lead to more dynamic rather than deliberate targeting, and you said it would lower the threshold. However, in my experience, I would disagree because I don't think dynamic targeting has a lower threshold in legal terms. And for Jonathan, I just wondered whether you considered that the questions that you have, in my experience, they also exist in conventional targeting, and they are not necessarily very specific only in the use of autonomous weapon systems.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have 3 questions. Let me add a fourth so that we ask a question to everybody on the panel. But just to summarize, the first question from the colleague from Microsoft about the regulation, given that you refer to the Convention on Conventional Weapons, I take it's more a question for our IHL part of the panel and, with the focus on autonomous weapon systems. So I let any of you come in on that as you like. Then there was a specific question for you, Taylor, from our colleague from the Belgian Cyber Command about dynamic targeting, and then Jonathan, to you about the overlaps with kinetic conventional targeting. And so to give Wayne also something to think about as we go through the first round of questions. Wayne, you spoke about a national legal regulation of AI tools used in penetration testing. So my question would be, what are the legal implications of cross-border aspects of AI penetration testing? So in other words, is international law the right framework when penetration testing, for example, accesses data that's stored in systems in other jurisdictions that are stored abroad? What are the international law implications so that we also draw a link with the whole panel? Okay, but I'll let you think about that, and we start maybe in the order that we went. Taylor, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the questions. Maybe just to briefly touch on the question of regulation first before I get to the question that was directed at me. Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and I think something also to consider, especially in the context of debates in the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapons, is that other software-based applications of AI, such as decision support systems, have really been missing from this conversation for the last decade. And I think, in light of recent events, there is an increased sense that, okay, well, this is relevant today, perhaps more relevant on a short-term basis than autonomous weapon systems. So we really need to also consider AI for decision support when considering international regulation. Having said that, we do have an existing applicable framework as well. I do think that additional regulation can help to clarify and strengthen that regulation, but of course we can't forget that IHL also applies both to autonomous weapons and decision support systems. The second question then on the dynamic targeting. I'm actually quite reassured to hear that you don't believe the threshold to be lower in dynamic targeting situations. I do think, something we see in discussions around targeting, and particularly the concept of control and meaningful human control, which I think control in general can be problematic, but this idea that there is less control in dynamic situations of targeting, and that there is therefore more tolerance for kind of less extensive legal assessments, let's say. And I think this kind of argumentation has also been used to kind of justify the use of AI in these contexts. And there is this real risk that this sense of urgency, the increased pace, really shifts how we think also about deliberate targeting and the necessity to conduct prudent legal assessments in that context as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Taylor. Over to you, Scott.
I'll address the where is this going issue. If we were to go back 2 or 3 years and think about what the discussion looked like in relationship to AI on the battlefield, there was, frankly, a good amount of discussion regarding explainability. But if we fast forward to the most recent US-led effort on the political declaration and creating rules on AI on the battlefield, we don't see an emphasis on explainability. We don't really see explainability at all. And that's, I think, in part because there is this perception of the explainability accuracy trade-off, right? This idea that the more explainable the system is, the less accurate it is. And there's a lot one could say about whether or not that trade-off is real. But as the systems are becoming more and more opaque, I think the policymakers have set that to the side. So we're seeing, at least in soft law, an attempt to create rules, right, or some consensus. And I think it would be best for all for explainability to re-enter that discussion. Because I do think that we can embed it within some of those principles, and I hope that we see that going forward. Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah. I'm going to address the question concerning the overlap with conventional targeting. I agree completely, and it's also not claimed that this is something completely separate and completely different from conventional targeting or any kind of targeting, like even cyber. Obviously, like many of these principles apply equally to conventional targeting. What is different, I would say, and why it necessitates us looking a bit deeper into this question and theorizing about it, is that there is this element, if you have an AI system, where the AI system itself is deployed and then left alone and allowed to make micro decisions, which I mentioned there in terms of shots. It is allowed to release individual shots without that necessarily being separate attacks. And this is a bit different from conventional targeting in the sense that in conventional targeting, you often still have a person a bit lower in the chain. You can think, for example, of a bombardment order where a commander is ordering an attack, and then the plane is allowed to fly to the target, but there is still a pilot there who then sees, for example, okay, it's a hospital, and then the person cancels. And this goes into the canceling obligation, obviously. Now, if you have this system, which is then released and allowed to make micro decisions itself, there is no more human there. That means that the legal decision, and especially most of the risk mitigation measures, move a bit forward into the decision-making cycle, all going into the commander's position. And that's why I think it is quite important to look exactly into the scope of the commander's obligations at the point of deployment. At the point of deployment, what are the legal obligations of this commander as to the targeting tests that they must perform, and also the timings. For example, in the last example that I showed with the arrows, there are additional timings where, according to this methodology, the commander must reapply targeting tests because a new attack is being performed. And more clarity on that respect, I think, is quite crucial, especially for autonomous attacks. But I'm not saying at all that this is exclusive to autonomous attacks.
Okay, and we'll finish this round with Wayne.
In the scenario I mentioned in my presentation, that it's under a national, one nation or one region situation, and even though there's only one nation, and the legal relationship would be complex enough. But it's true that nowadays we have very much kind of international storage or cloud services. So I think it's necessary to discuss about the international lawsuit related to AI cases. What I think is the traditional international law on civil procedure is okay. It may not have to make adjustment. The key point would be the law, when the court decides to apply, whether it has makes the clear requirements about when the case is related to AI. And the most important would be the burden of proof. And so I think that's the main point.
And there's certainly space for further study, right? So maybe a paper for next year's CyCon about that. Let's open to another round of questions. Do we have, yes, I see Talita in the front. Do we have any other questions so that we take a round? We will have one from there, maybe one more. Okay, so we start with Talita and then gentleman in the back. Can I ask for the microphone in the front? We will need one microphone just here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the panelists for wonderful presentations. I have a...
Sorry, Talita, can you also introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name is Talita and I'm a research fellow at Chatham House. I have a question for Jonathan. So you explained in quite a lot of detail these different sort of like scopes of analysis, these different legal theories about how to group shots or different steps in the attack process. But I was wondering how exactly would these different approaches impact on the actual proportionality assessment? Because at the end of the day, you're trying to measure foreseeable damage against civilians with, military advantage. So what would be the implications in terms of proportionality for each of the approaches that you devised in your paper? Thank you.
Thank you, Talita. And then we had a question just there in the back.
Hello, thank you. My name's Scott Bellows, U.S. Military Academy. These are also both for Dr. Kwik, kind of two questions in one. They're maybe a bit far out in the future, but the first question is, if you were to have an autonomous weapon system that's known to make that legal assessment maybe to a higher degree of accuracy than a human commander who's naturally going to make human mistakes, do you think that would change your model in any sense, where maybe the system could have a higher degree of autonomy? And the second related question is, if you're in a system where the commander either has a high number of systems at his disposal, or they're in a prolonged engagement where maybe it's difficult for the legal commander to make all those evaluations, there's going to be constant kind of queries to him, how would you propose managing a situation like that, or would we just have to avoid such a case entirely?
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions right now in the audience? So, yeah, there's one there in the back.
Thank you. Herb Lin, Stanford University. I think my question is to Taylor about your claim that law can't take into account, the application of law can't take into account statistical information. That has to be judged, that every case has to be judged entirely on its own without, I think that's just what you said, on its own without any reference to any historical patterns. That doesn't sound right to me, and I hope you can explain that some more.
Okay, so we have three questions. Two of them are for Jonathan, but since we don't have that much time, let's dive right into it, and then we see if we add more to them. So Jonathan, the question from Talita about proportionality, and then the two questions from the gentleman from the military academy about autonomy and the higher number of incidents. And then the question from Professor Lin from Stanford University to you, Taylor, about statistical information. Jonathan.
So technical stuff, can I ask you to open my presentation again?
Our colleagues, our technical colleagues, could we please open Jonathan's presentation on the screen, if possible? Well, I don't know if it can come up now. Maybe you have to explain.
Yes, I'll describe very quickly. So in my paper, it was in my slide, but unfortunately I didn't have time. So obviously, as I said, attack is a unit of measurement. So for each attack, you should determine the proportionality. It is actually extremely important, the attack scope that you choose for particular situations. In this situation, I gave an example of an attack on a town that was guarded by two groups of tanks here. And the question to the commander here is, there are two possible ways you can qualify this. You can qualify this as one signature attack with the entire route as your search area, or two group attacks, where you have search area 1 or search area 2. Here you can also see there is a civilian building in search area 2 that is very likely to be damaged if you launch your autonomous system to this situation. Now, if you qualify this as one signature attack, then this is probably proportional, because one civilian building will be struck for destroying 13 tanks. Yeah. However, if you determine that these are separate search areas, two group attacks, then, okay, sure, the first attack on the left is fine, because there is no collateral damage at all. But on the right, one civilian building will be damaged just to destroy two tanks. Now, probably a reasonable commander would say, okay, this is not proportionate. So here you can see the very significant impact that your choice of attack scope will make. And this is also a good demonstration of how commanders will be tempted to go more to the right. As I said, their military efficiency goes up to the right, but it reduces civilian protection. And the point of providing more transparency and less ambiguity regarding attack scope is exactly this: to provide clarity to post-analysis, is this reasonable? And depending on how far the search area is, for example, you can say, okay, it is justified or not justified to classify this as one signature attack, or should this rather be two group attacks? So for example, if this is 500 meters apart, probably the proximity in time and space is not there anymore, and you have to classify this as a group attack. Good questions from the gentleman. Concerning the higher accuracy of the systems, again, I think this also reflects the general consensus in the overall debate that the international community is not yet ready to acknowledge that the system itself is making these decisions. So in that respect, even if the accuracy increases, it doesn't really change the analysis, because what we're looking here is the perspective of the commander. How the commander is supposed to make legal decisions and at what timings if they are launching an autonomous attack. It doesn't really matter how accurate it is, apart from, for example, the determination if this is a discriminate system or not. Is this an indiscriminate system? Can it properly reach my objectives? This would obviously also have an impact on the proportionality test, the military advantage, etc. So no, this would not change it, but if you change your beginning perspective of, okay, they can implement IHL for commanders, then it might, but that's outside of the scope of my theory, at least. Also, the higher number of systems is a very good point. Actually, a higher number of systems would positively impact proximity in time and space. So, for example, in the attack on the 4 tanks, if you have a lot of systems that are released at the same time to attack all of these tanks, then your time space actually decreases, which increases the epistemic proximity of the commander to the actual situation on the field, which increases their ability to make recent decisions. So if you have multiple systems which attack these tanks at the same time, I would argue that the proximity actually increases, which would increase the probability of the commander justifiably qualifying this as one signature attack, compared to if one system has to fly around and attack each of these tanks one after the other, for example. But then for your question concerning how this affects if you have too many systems, yes, this may negatively impact the ability of the commander to make decisions. I agree completely. And again, this is not directly related to this theory, but this goes more into the general consensus, I would say, of this panel, that a commander has to have sufficient epistemic certainty as to the situation on the field and what launching an attack will do concerning what targets will be struck, what collateral damage will be caused to make reasoned decisions. So
and none of the questions were for me, but I have just 10 seconds, which was just to say, when you say no, right? Like, we have to understand that each of these models, they're non-transferable. Just because one was really, really good in one conflict doesn't tell us very much about how it would operate in a different context, right? So, like, I think there's often that question of what if we know? But I think that the knowing is almost impossible, especially when we look forward. Sorry, Taylor.
Thank you, Scott. And I'm looking at David. We can have a little bit of extra time just to finish. So, Taylor, please don't feel under pressure. Feel free to give the answer that you like, and then we will wrap up the session together.
Great. Thank you for the question and perhaps an opportunity for some clarification. I agree with you. I do think, of course, military practitioners draw on their own past experiences. Also, that experience is institutionalized through training, through other processes and procedures, rules and engagements. I just don't think it's enough for legal reasoning. Legal reasoning is more than mere pattern matching. You really have to account for any kind of novelty and nuance, and this might not be reflected in training data sets that these models are trained on. Conflict is a dynamic and complicated environment, and legal advisors and commanders need to be able to be adaptable and agile in that setting. And when it comes to legal assessments, in addition to past experience, they also draw on abductive logical reasoning, qualitative assessments that aren't amenable to being quantified. I think the proportionality assessment, as mentioned, is a really good example of that, as well as these values that I also mentioned around both military cultural values, moral values, and balancing military necessity and humanitarian considerations.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah,
Taylor.
great.
And so thank you all for also bearing with us 2 or so minutes over time. I think, we can see that we have exhausted the time, but definitely not the substance and definitely not the energy here on the stage. So I invite you all to consider this just as a starter of a conversation on these topics. So please feel free to continue the conversation with our panelists during the coffee break and further on during CyCon. Enjoy the rest of your conference, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panel today.